Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Muriel and in this video I will be doing a review for The Magicians written by Lev Grossman. The Magicians is a novel I've known about for several years now, but that I had actually decided not to read because I'd seen it compared to Vita Nostra, a novel I read last year and did not enjoy at all. But then my ex-partner David strongly recommended it to me and said I might enjoy a few specific elements and scenes in particular. So I decided to put it on my 2022 TBR and indeed thoroughly enjoyed it. In fact, The Magicians, which I listened to on audiobook while I was repainting my bedroom, is the best novel I have read so far this year that wasn't a reread. Published in 2009, The Magicians follows Quentin Coldwater, a depressed but intellectually gifted high school senior who also finds comfort and escape in a series of portal fancy children's books called Filler and Further, as he stumbles upon an entrance exam for and subsequently gains admittance into a magical university called Breakbills, where he will study for 5 years in order to become a magician or sorcerer. Most all words associated with magic and magic users are actually used at some point or another in the novel, which I liked. Depressed as he is, alienated as he feels from his own life, Quentin desperately hopes that becoming a magician will fix him, give him purpose and meaning to his life. But will it really? The truth, alas, is that things are more complicated than that. And whilst The Magicians covers the 5 years of Quentin attending Breakbills University, the story does continue and ends beyond that period. Like I said, I listened to The Magicians on audio, and the narrator did an absolutely fantastic job. He really made the story and characters come alive, and experiencing the book this way definitely enhanced my enjoyment of it, so I would definitely recommend the audiobook as a very good option. Beyond that, I also just found, from what I could tell, Lev Grossman's prose to be of a very high caliber, and I believe it is pretty much a consensus, in fact, that The Magicians is an example of more literary fantasy. Though honestly, as an aside, at this point the way the word literary is used gets confusing for me. But anyway, another debate for another day. The author makes use of precise and varied language, creates beautiful metaphors at times, but doesn't hesitate to switch to more grittily realistic language and affectations when it is called for by a particular character's voice, for example. Which means I became very easily immersed in the world of The Magicians. I would add the story is overall medium paced, with the last third to fourth of the book being slightly faster paced and definitely more action-packed. Most of the novel covers Quentin Coldwater attending Breakbills University, like I said earlier, but continues beyond that, which could have created issues with the pacing, but honestly, I thought all of it was nicely balanced. I thought there was good to great character development throughout The Magicians, for Quentin as the main character, of course, but also for his friends at Breakbills as main to secondary characters as well, as all of them went through challenging experiences, in the last third of the book especially, that forced them to grow and mature as people and young adults. Breakbills is just full of what I'll call intellectually gifted, but mentally ill, neurodiverse perhaps, or simply damaged, I guess, older teens and young adults. It has, as a result, great representations for those categories of people, and it also has decent representation in other respects, with regards to sexuality, class, or even disability a tiny bit. Quentin's group, or set in particular, also reminded me of the group of student characters you have in, bear with me, the TV show How to Get Away with Murder. The Keating Five, I believe they were originally called. Both groups have a similar overachieving and cynical vibe to them, but whereas I didn't particularly love any of the characters in How to Get Away with Murder, or at least not at first, I developed a real fondness for the physical kids, that's the name of that group, in The Magicians. Perhaps because its members were even more fucked up than the Keating Five, intelligent or intellectually gifted, and I could relate to them more because of it. Maybe. Aside from this friend group, there is also a main romantic relationship involving Quentin and a character named Alice, who starts out being his close friend, a plus for me, that I really appreciated despite being generally pretty romance-averse in my literature, because I felt it was very realistic and I could relate to it pretty intensely given what was happening to me in my intimate relationship when I listened to the book. It just felt, well, so real, painfully so at times, and I was deeply moved by it actually. Finally, I want to touch upon the characteristic assholishness Quentin displays in The Magicians, which seems to put off a lot of readers and the way it intersects with his experience of mental illness. To be clear, Quentin isn't the only character who acts like a dick at times, but as he is the story's main, the focus is on him and his behavior. Quentin is most definitely an asshole at times, yes, though definitely not a sociopath, as I've seen some reviews comment on Goodreads, like, seriously? How is he a sociopath? He feels love, remorse, and empathy, and does eventually learn from some of his mistakes. All that pretty much excludes sociopathy as a diagnosis, just saying. I do think Quentin's behavior results in part from his suffering, from the pain and anguish he feels through his depression. Feeling lost, bereft of meaning and direction can certainly cause one to lash out in anger. And anger, after all, is oftentimes a band-aid emotion covering up festering sadness, loss, or anguish. Or perhaps cause isn't quite the right word. Mental anguish, suffering can make it easier to lash out in anger and hurt loved ones in the process. But I also think it comes down to personality as well. A lot of mentally people, after all, are extremely kind, caring, compassionate, and will blame themselves for everything rather than intuit others may be adding to their distress, even when it is actually the case. Mental illness, I have always said, is never an excuse, as far as I'm concerned, for bad behavior, for causing harm, but it can provide some context and perhaps mitigating circumstances if the mentally ill person learns and moves on from their bad behavior. An unusual outcome, in my personal experience, especially if you already reached a certain age, but still it can happen. So I think some people miss or dismiss too quickly this context, perhaps, when it comes to Quentin, who is also, after all, fairly young in The Magicians. Though I don't like invoking age to excuse bad behavior either, because blaming it on teenage hormones and stuff to me isn't always good enough, and there are some teenagers who are quite mature and responsible and kind and not hurtful, but again, a debate for another day. So reading The Magicians was also specifically moving and heart-hitting for me because A, I could relate to Quentin and also Alice, his girlfriend, given his experience of being intellectually gifted, depressed, and feeling alienated from the world, though I don't think I've ever behaved quite as nastily as he sometimes does, though obviously it's for others to say or not, I suppose. And B, because Quentin strongly reminded me of two of my exes, Philip and David, who both suffer from mental illness and have acted like massive assholes, to me at least, though I also know they acted like assholes to some of their exes, partly because of their mental illness. I was also reminded of my grandmother as well, though to a lesser extent. She was probably on the spectrum like me and severely depressed as well most of her life, but unlike me, she often acted like a bitch to her family members, my mother included. It's a whole thing. Anyway, in my ex Philip's case, the intellectual giftedness aspect didn't apply, but he was emotionally abusive towards me, though I don't think he ever meant to be, if that makes sense, and what I know of his life and his experience as a very young man came to mind as I read The Magicians. There is also substance abuse in The Magicians, and my ex Philip is an alcoholic who never got out of it. David, on the other hand, is very intelligent, a loner, a nerd, much like Quentin, much like me, which is why we were so compatible, and he treated me like absolute garbage, following a personality-altering mental breakdown that led him to break up violently with me, a bit like the way Quentin treats his girlfriend Alice at one point in the book, though I would argue David behaved much worse overall. The point, in any case, is David's behavior, personality change even, was informed by mental illness, but cannot be entirely excused by it, however much I might want to do so. And in the case of the magicians, I thought Lev Grossman did just a brilliant job portraying all of this through Quentin, though in his case he does learn to some degree from his mistakes, which certainly wasn't the case with Philip, who never acknowledged the harm he did me, and which sadly probably won't be the case with David, given the trajectory he's on. The Magicians features dark, whimsical, even absurdist at times world building, and is definitely on the softer side of things when it comes to things like magic or magical objects and creatures. Don't expect solid explanations for how the magic actually works. Don't expect hard and fast rules to memorize and analyze, basically. The magic practiced by magicians, sorcerers, shamans, and the like, and taught at break bills, is purposefully described as being neither an art form or a science, or rather a practical craft to be mastered over many years of one's life that draws on some sort of energy that no one knows the exact nature or origin of. Though there are sub-branches to its specialties, if you will, each individual will have a different affinity for. All kinds of magic are thus taught at break bills and apparently at other magic colleges around the world, which are briefly mentioned, from herbalism to physical transformations, the manipulation of light or weather, to more psychic stuff. There are also a lot of meta and sarcastically humorous references made to Harry Potter that I thoroughly enjoyed, and more broadly the world building and atmosphere of the Magicians draws parallels to things like Harry Potter, yes, but also the Chronicles of Narnia quite strongly, or even I would argue Alice in Wonderland, with the childhood literature lens removed. Indeed, those influences are very much adultified and darkened in The Magicians. For example, you learn at one point that the author of the Fillory and Further children's book series, which is basically The Magicians in-world Chronicles of Narnia, was a pedophile. And this leads to consequences down the line our main characters have to deal with in the novel. The whimsical is thus very much entwined with the darkly, grittily realistic, and it is this precise coloring that really matters for the story and its theme, rather than having, everything magical make perfect sense. Finally, I appreciated some of the risks the author took with some of the book scenes and plot points. Besides the example I just mentioned involving the pedophilic writer of the Fillory books, I want to mention in particular a scene where Quentin's class at break bills transforms into a group of Arctic foxes, and he and Alice, which aren't yet a couple at that point, have sex for the first time as, well, Arctic foxes. It is described in some detail and conveys a non-human animal's point of view in a very convincing fashion. It just worked, as far as I'm concerned. And this is in fact one of the scenes David told me I would find particularly interesting and striking. As I told him, I've had several dreams in my life where I had sex as a non-human animal. True story. And this is apparently fairly unusual. You tell me. In any case, I was impressed, as I'd never read anything like that before, even though I've come across some pretty weird stuff in my SFF over the years. Some novels contain several themes, delved into with varying degrees of thoroughness. Others explore only one main thematic idea, but do so with a satisfying amount of depth. The Magicians belongs to the latter category because it really focuses on mental illness, depression specifically, and the way it affects the growing individual, and their relationship to the world and others as its central theme. Quentin never acknowledges in so many words that he is depressed/clinically depressed. He doesn't take medication, has never received treatment, in fact, nor a diagnosis. But as someone who is intimately familiar with clinical depression, it was obvious to me that Quentin was himself a clinically depressed character. His depression waxes and wanes throughout the book, as it often does in real life for a lot of chronic sufferers, and at times it abates and lessens to a state of mild anhedonia or dysphoria, but it is definitely there. And it is there from the very start of the novel, when you first meet Quentin and quickly realize that despite his intellectual gifts, despite having two close friends, Quentin feels out of place in the world and struggles to find meaning and motivation to move forward in life. He's going through the motions basically, and he's only 19 years old. when you are in that state of mind and mood, it is easy, if you haven't completely given hope on everything, to latch onto something that looks like it will finally give your life purpose and meaning. This is exactly what happens with Quentin when he discovers Breakbills and quickly gains admission to it. Magic, he believes, I guess it's a reasonable assumption, all things considered, will finally give light and spark to his life, but it doesn't. Not really. Depression is a complex disorder, more often than not mixing biological, psychological, and social etiological factors that are difficult to separate and thus treat neatly or efficiently, and putting a band-aid on it doesn't work long term, I should know. For Quentin, magic is that band-aid, and as an aside, I found it ironic that the magicians of the world, in The Magicians, haven't cracked a spell to cure or at least significantly help with depression. Magic cannot fix what's hurting inside of Quentin, cannot fix his personality-related or behavioral issues, in short, his assholish disposition, like I talked about in the character section. It cannot fix his growing pains either, and yes, I do acknowledge you can technically add coming of age / growing up as a second theme or developmental arc for the Magicians, but I've never related to coming-of-age narratives, perhaps due to my own asynchronous development, and I find the depression angle much more personally meaningful and relevant. You see Quentin struggle with ennui, melancholia, depressive restlessness even, as he acquires magical knowledge of Breakbills and grows in magical power as a magician, though, not necessarily wisdom, of course. And it all comes to a head when the students at Breakbills learn that once they've received their diploma, there isn't any kind of set path laid out for them to continue their journey through life. They can do doctorates in magic, sort of, is what I understood. They can influence the world ideally for good with their magic, sure, but the general idea seems to be, do whatever. You basically have the power of gods at your fingertips, but as to what you should do with it, figure it out yourselves, dipshits. So, it's not that big of a surprise that Quentin and his friends find themselves adrift after graduation, and in another dark show of gritty realism, you then see them fall into an empty, hedonistic lifestyle that involves plenty of drugs and mindless parties, things like that. So substance abuse being very common among mentally ill people, it made complete sense to me that some of the characters would try to fight their pain and feelings of emptiness, of aimlessness, with booze and things like cocaine, I believe. I know I'm painting a pretty dark picture here, but the novel doesn't ultimately end on an entirely dark note, though I won't say more than that so as not to spoil things too much. Suffice it to say that I was impressed by the magician's portrayal, handling of mental illness / depression, though it could have been even better in my opinion had suicidality been a bigger part of the picture. I feel someone like Quentin should have been shown to be overtly suicidal at times, and he wasn't. The same could perhaps be said about self-harm as well, though in all fairness, substance abuse can be considered a kind of self-harm, so it is a lesser qualm. As I stated in the introduction, The Magicians is the best novel I've read so far this year that wasn't a reread. It was just a very good read that I rated with an 8.5 out of 10, and that I would highly recommend if you're in search of more literary fancy with both a dark and whimsical setting that features intellectually gifted young adults and delves into the topic of mental illness. In fact, this will now be my go-to recommendation for readers in search of mental illness / depression representation and thematic exploration in SFF. Until I find something as good or better to recommend alongside it, of course. I am aware The Magicians is the first book in a trilogy, but I was really satisfied with the novel's conclusion, both from a character arc and thematic development perspective. As such, I don't particularly feel the need or desire to continue with the series, but I am open to counter-arguments. I am also aware there is a TV show adaptation of the books. Have in fact seen a few episodes from season 1 of... I watched them a few years ago, actually, way before I read the novel. It wasn't bad at all, so maybe I'll revisit it, continue with it, if I can find the concentration and attention span to watch TV shows again. So on that note, I hope you enjoyed this review. Do share your thoughts if you feel so inclined. I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all relatively soon in another video. Bye-bye.